this is what life was like in Cardiff. When Welsh coal was heating the entire world, a town of 2,000 became a city of 160,000 in a single century. In 1801, Cardiff was a small market town with a population of approximately 2,000 people. It had a modest castle, a weekly market, a handful of inns, and almost nothing else that would have distinguished it from dozens of other small Welsh towns of its kind. A century later, in 1901, Cardiff had a population of 164,333. The transformation was one of the most rapid and complete urban expansions in the history of the British Isles. It had no precedent in Wales and few outside it. The engine of this transformation was coal, specifically the extraordinarily high-quality steam coal buried in the valleys that ran north from Cardiff into the mountains of Glamorgan, the Rhondda, the Cynon, the Rhymney, and the Taff. As the world industrialised and as steam replaced sail on the oceans, the coal that powered the Royal Navy and the merchant fleets of a dozen nations passed through Cardiff. The question that this transformation raises, and that residents of Cardiff in the 1880s lived inside without necessarily understanding, is what it meant to live in a city whose entire reason for existing was to move a substance from underneath the ground to ships waiting in a dock. Cardiff was not a city that made things, it was a city that moved things, and for several decades around the turn of the 20th century, nothing in the world was moved in greater quantities. The Marquess of Bute built the docks that built Cardiff. The man most directly responsible for Cardiff's transformation was not a Welsh industrialist or a local entrepreneur. He was John Crichton Stuart, the second Marquess of Bute, a Scottish nobleman who owned the mineral rights beneath much of Glamorgan, and who in 1839 funded the construction of the Bute West Dock, the first purpose-built dock at Cardiff, entirely from his own fortune. The dock covered 19 acres with 9,400 feet of quays. It cost him an enormous sum and it was a commercial gamble. In 1839, the coal trade out of Cardiff was still modest. The railways that would link the valleys to the coast were not yet built, and there was no certainty that the volume of traffic would ever justify the investment. The Taff Vale Railway opened in 1841, linking Cardiff to Abercynon, and the gamble began to pay off with startling speed. Coal shipments from Cardiff exceeded 1 million tonnes for the first time in 1851. The Bute East Dock opened in 1855, and in December of that year, the first trainload of Rhondda steam coal arrived at the new facility. By 1862, 2 million tonnes of coal were being exported annually from Cardiff docks. The third Marquess of Bute, who inherited the estate and the docks in 1848, became for a period the wealthiest man in the world, a distinction that rested entirely on the coal passing through the docks his father had built. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming content about the United Kingdom and its history. Thank you for your support, and now let's continue. By 1883, the docks handled 6 million tonnes of coal annually. The figures that document Cardiff's coal trade in the 1880s are almost too large to read with full comprehension. By 1883, the docks at Cardiff were handling 6 million tonnes of coal annually, a volume that required hundreds of ships in port at any given time, thousands of dock workers loading and unloading around the clock, a continuous procession of coal trains from the valleys arriving at the sidings above the docks, and an entire commercial infrastructure of coal brokers, shipping agents, insurance underwriters, and financial services clustered in the streets of the town above the waterfront. Cardiff was the largest coal exporting port in the world. The coal it exported, the hard anthracite and the high-quality steam coal of the South Wales valleys, powered the Royal Navy, the merchant fleets of Britain, France and their allies, and the locomotives of railways on every inhabited continent. Welsh steam coal had been proven by John Nixon in the 1840s to burn directly in ship boilers without coking, making it uniquely valuable as a maritime fuel. The navies of the world that switched from sail to steam needed Welsh coal, and Welsh coal came through Cardiff. The town had become the pivot on which the maritime power of the British Empire turned. By 1913, at the peak of the trade, Cardiff and the nearby port of Barry together exported more than 13 million tonnes of coal in a single year, a figure that briefly made this corner of South Wales the most commercially significant port complex on Earth. Tiger Bay became 50 nationalities in a single district. The labour that made the Cardiff docks work did not come primarily from Cardiff itself, it came from the world. The ships that arrived at the Bute docks to take on Welsh coal brought with them sailors, engineers and maritime workers from every corner of the globe, and a significant proportion of those men, Somali, Norwegian, Yemeni, Spanish, Italian, Caribbean, Irish, West African, and dozens of other nationalities, chose not to reboard when their ships departed. They remained in Cardiff, in the district that had grown up immediately adjacent to the docks along Bute Street, in a community that historians have estimated eventually encompassed at least 50 different nationalities living within a few streets of each other. This district was known as Tiger Bay. The name applied to the dockland area of Bute Town that had grown from the 1840s onwards. By the 1880s, it was one of the most genuinely cosmopolitan communities in Britain, at a time when Britain outside London was largely homogeneous. The Chinese laundries, the Somali boarding houses, the Arab cafes, the Norwegian seamen's mission, and the Irish pubs of Tiger Bay existed alongside each other with a degree of cohabitation that reflected both the transient nature of maritime life and the practical necessity of making a community work in conditions of close physical proximity. Tiger Bay also had a notorious reputation for its red light district, its illegal gambling dens, and its opium bars, the infrastructure of entertainment that any port district serving a transient male workforce tends to develop. The coal exchange determined the price of coal for the entire world. At the centre of Cardiff's commercial life in the 1880s stood the Coal Exchange, a trading hall built in Mount Stuart Square, Bute Town, that opened in 1884 and that functioned as the global marketplace for Welsh coal. On the floor of the Coal Exchange, brokers and buyers from shipping companies, naval authorities, and industrial concerns from across the world negotiated the price of coal on the British market. The price set in Mount Stuart Square determined what shipping companies paid for fuel on every ocean. It determined the cost of powering the Royal Navy. It determined the fuel costs of merchant fleets from Britain, Germany, France, Italy, and their empires. In 1907, the first £1 million business deal in British history was struck on the floor of the Cardiff Coal Exchange, a transaction so significant in its scale that it was reported across the national press and subsequently cited as evidence of Cardiff's commercial importance. The building itself was designed in an ornate Italianate style that signalled the ambitions of the city's commercial elite. Its trading floor, ringed by galleries, was the physical space in which Cardiff's claim to be the coal capital of the world was enacted in daily commercial life. The Coal Exchange survives today as a listed building in Cardiff Bay, the floor where the world's coal prices were once set, now sometimes used for concerts and public events. The population grew 80% per decade between 1840 and 1870. The speed of Cardiff's population growth in the Victorian period was exceptional even by the standards of the Industrial Revolution, which produced urban expansions across Britain that had no precedent in human history. Between 1840 and 1870, Cardiff's population grew at approximately 80% per decade, a rate that outpaced Manchester, Birmingham, and most other British cities during the same period. The people who arrived in Cardiff in these decades came from multiple sources, from the Welsh countryside, from the valleys above, from the west of England, from Ireland in enormous numbers following the Great Famine of the 1840s, and from the world's maritime network via the docks. By 1841, a quarter of Cardiff's population was English-born, and more than 10% had been born in Ireland. The Irish community concentrated in a district north of the docks known as Newtown, described by local historians as Cardiff's Little Ireland, which occupied the area between what is now the Atrium Building and the Docklands. By 1881, Cardiff had overtaken Merthyr Tydfil and Swansea to become the largest town in Wales. The physical fabric of the city struggled to keep pace with the population. Housing was built rapidly and cheaply, sanitation was inadequate, and the public health implications of dense urban growth in the absence of adequate infrastructure were visible in mortality statistics that compared unfavourably with the national average throughout the period of fastest growth. The Rhondda fed the docks, and the docks fed Cardiff. The coal that passed through Cardiff came primarily from the valleys of Glamorgan, the Rhondda, the Cynon, the Taff, the Rhymney, through a railway network that had been built specifically to move coal from pit head to dock. The Taff Vale Railway was the first and most important link, connecting the collieries of Merthyr Tydfil to Cardiff from 1841. As new collieries opened further up the valleys, and as the output of existing collieries expanded, additional railway lines were built. The entire industrial geography of South Wales in the second half of the 19th century was organised around the movement of coal from underground in the valleys to ships waiting in the docks at Cardiff. The coal trucks that moved south from the valleys entered Cardiff from the north, ran through the northern suburbs on dedicated freight lines that crossed the town without interacting with the normal street grid, and descended to the sidings above the docks where the coal was held before being loaded onto ships. The loading process itself was mechanical. The trucks were tipped by hydraulic machinery into chutes that ran down to the ship's hold, filling each vessel in hours rather than the days that manual loading would have required. The efficiency of the coal loading process at Cardiff was itself a commercial advantage. Ships spent less time in port, which meant they could complete more voyages per year, which meant the economics of Welsh coal transport worked better than those of competing ports. Devonshire House competed with Bute Street for the world's attention. The wealth generated by the Cardiff coal trade did not stay in Cardiff. The Marquises of Bute, who owned the docks and received royalties on every ton of coal that passed through them, were among the wealthiest men in Britain, but their principal residences were in London and Scotland. The third Marquis of Bute used his coal fortune to build one of the most extraordinary private buildings in Britain, Cardiff Castle, which was transformed from a medieval ruin into a Gothic fantasy palace by the architect William Burgess between 1867 and 1881. The castle's interior, its Arab room, its banqueting hall, its clock tower, is one of the most extravagant examples of Victorian decorative excess in existence. Burgess also worked for Bute on Castell Coch, a fairy tale Gothic castle built in the hills above Cardiff and used by the Marquess as a summer retreat. Together, the two buildings consumed a fortune that could only have been generated by the quantities of coal moving through the docks below. The rest of Cardiff's commercial elite, the coal brokers, the shipping agents, the railway executives, the colliery owners, built themselves substantial houses in the fashionable suburbs north of the city centre. Roath, Penillyn and Pontcanna, where the streets of solid Victorian terraces and semi-detached villas that still characterised those districts were constructed on the profits of the coal trade. The Barry Docks challenged Cardiff's supremacy from 1889. Cardiff's position as the undisputed coal exporting capital of the world was challenged from the late 1880s by a development that originated in the frustration of one of the Rhondda's most successful coal owners with the congestion and costs of the Cardiff dock system. David Davies of Llandinum, the self-made contractor and colliery owner who had founded the Ocean Coal Company and opened multiple collieries in the Upper Rhondda, had been exporting coal through Cardiff throughout the 1870s and 1880s and had accumulated frustration with the Bute Dock Trustees' cautious approach to expanding dock capacity and with the high charges levied for the use of the Taff Vale Railway and the Bute facilities. Davies promoted the Barry Railway Company, securing parliamentary authorisation for a new railway and dock at Barry, a coastal town 8 miles southwest of Cardiff. Barry Docks opened in 1889. The response from Cardiff was slow. The Roath Dock had only opened in 1887, and plans for the Queen Alexandra Dock were not completed until 1907. By 1901, coal exports from Barry had surpassed those from Cardiff in volume. The commercial administration of the coal trade, the coal exchange, the brokers, the agents, the financial services, remained centred in Cardiff, but the physical bulk of the coal was increasingly moving through Barry's more modern and less congested facilities. Cardiff's coal century ended in the 1920s and never returned. The extraordinary period of Cardiff's coal supremacy lasted approximately from the opening of the Bute West Dock in 1839 to the First World War of 1914 to 1918. In 1913, the peak year, Cardiff and Barry together handled over 13 million tonnes of coal, a figure that represented the culmination of 80 years of continuous growth, and that was never subsequently exceeded. The war disrupted the trade but did not immediately end it. What ended it was the aftermath. The market for steam coal was flooded with cheap German coal supplied as war reparations under the Treaty of Versailles, which undercut Welsh coal prices in the markets that had sustained the trade. The collapse of the coal price in the 1920s hit the South Wales valleys with catastrophic severity. Unemployment in the mining communities reached levels that produced the hunger marches, the mass emigration, and the social devastation of the interwar period. In Cardiff, the dock trade contracted sharply. The coal exchange, which had set the world price for coal in the first decade of the century, saw its trading floor emptied. Tiger Bay, which had been sustained by the labour and commerce of the docks, entered a long period of decline. The city that coal had built lost its commercial raison d'etre within a decade of its absolute peak. Cardiff would not become the capital of Wales officially until 1955, by which time the coal that had built it had almost entirely ceased to flow.